Well, if I have not met you, my name's Josh Sperry. I'm kind of doing two roles here today. I've served at the network the last 3 years, so I get to just be here to support Zach, and then now I'm with all of Crest. I just transitioned, and so really excited about some of the content that you're going to be hearing from this. I'm so grateful for what we get to do in this. I love our network, and then now being in this new season is exciting for us. For all the youth pastors and youth leaders in the room, I think this content's going to be really helpful. For those of you that don't know, and Kelly, if I'm off a little bit, you can feel free to fix it. But around 2020, Supreme Court passed from a case that was there. Essentially, there was a group of family members that were not given the opportunity as much as they would have liked to be able to bring a child into their own care, and that child was adopted other than back to a biological family. And because of that, a lot has changed in all of Crest world, in the state world, this last couple years, specifically when it comes to negligence and kids being placed. The reason I share that with you, for youth pastors and youth leaders, you're going to see a lot more of this. I think in your youth ministries in the next few years. There will be some parents that all of a sudden will have kids with them that haven't had them before. And so really this conversation is one that's important. I know it's close to a lot of our hearts in different ways. So I'm excited for us to have this. Kelly is becoming a good friend. We've known each other for all of 3 days, but they've been a really good 3 days. And so, but truly I'm excited to introduce Kelly. She'll be giving the content today, and then we should have some time for Q&A at the end.
Great.
So thanks, Kelly.
Thanks, Josh. Okay, can I just go ahead and use this mic? Start using this mic?
It should
it's
be good
on.
to go.
Okay, good to go. All right. Well, welcome everyone. That's quite a session you came from, and I was feeling it myself over here. So, but thanks for coming. I'd like to just get a feel for who's in the room so I can try and tailor some of this content. I know we're a little bit kind of behind schedule, so I'll do my best to honor your time, but also my heart is really to just I want to be able to equip you to serve your kids well. Whatever kids are walking through your doors, whatever they're coming in with, whatever baggage, we're all believers here. We all believe that God is a powerful God, and He deals with us in compassion so that we can be healed, right? So if you don't mind, if it's okay with all of you, my top goals for you today is to really understand what is trauma, what could it possibly look like in our students that we're serving, and what is my responsibility or your responsibility in your respective contexts in order to respond to it. Does that feel like helpful information for you?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And it will hopefully cut down the time too, so that we can get you what you need and get you on your way so that you can be connecting relationally with one another. I know that's one of the benefits of being in a conference like this. So in this room, how many of you are youth pastors here? Okay, great. Got some. How many of you are volunteers and you're helping youth in your youth groups? Okay, great. Awesome. And then do we have any senior leaders, executive pastors, associate pastors also in the room? Okay, perfect. And then last question, how many of you were here last year and maybe attended my colleague's presentation of this last year? Okay, no one. Okay, well, this information will be new then for everyone. All right, well, let's just pray first, invite God's presence here, and then we'll get going. Father, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for what you're doing in hearts and minds of our youth leaders, our pastors. They're dear to our hearts. They're on the front lines of ministry. We ask that you would equip and train us today, and even more so, Lord, that your spirit and your voice would be big in us, so that you would point out to us the students in our ministries that we serve that maybe need a little extra help in this area. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Okay, let's roll. Imagine with me that You walk into a room full of your teens, your youth group, the teens that you're working with. You walk into the room and you notice, say, Mackenzie. She seems to be aloof in the corner, kind of got her hoodie on, kind of a little withdrawn, not talking. You're curious about it, but then you also see Chris staring down Jaden in the other corner. And then you're wondering what's going on. You love that kid, Chris, but he can kind of be, he's been angry a little bit more these days, a little bit more irritable these days. Then you've got a couple of volunteers who have come and mentioned those concerns to you. And maybe you are a volunteer that has maybe noticed concerning behavior from a kid. And maybe at times you've reported, hey, I'm a little intimidated when behaviors start to get out of control. Maybe a little bit. And then finally, you've got Rosie who's headed your way. And she's got tears in her eyes, and you're not sure if it's because she broke another nail or because she's, didn't get what she wanted. And you're wondering, okay, what's it going to take for me to be able to meet the need and help calm her down? Has anyone ever experienced any of those scenarios in here with your kids? Yeah, I see heads nodding all across the room. And so what I'd like to do is kind of equip you to know trauma is a big subject, but let's kind of bring it down to something that's more practical for you so that you can kind of have an idea of, okay, what could I potentially be dealing with and what could be my next steps? So just an easy visual of things that you may already be experiencing. And I also recognize that as volunteers, you may already have some experience in this area. Please feel free. This is interactive. I would love if you have tidbits of information to share from your experience. Please feel free to share so that we can all benefit from each other's learnings. Quick intro. I work for a nonprofit, faith-based, state licensed foster agency called Olive Crest, and we're dedicated to preventing child abuse by strengthening, equipping, and restoring children and families in crisis, one life at a time. That's our programs that we've got, and I'm going to start more broadly with the definition of what is trauma. Trauma is actually a huge subject and way more nuanced and deep than I can go into in 45 minutes. So what I'm going to do, like I said, is funnel it down to what's most helpful. The APA's definition of trauma is the emotional response someone has to an extremely negative event. And oftentimes in youth culture, I think even more broadly in some of our larger population, the word trauma can often be overused. Like, there was a spider in the bathroom. I'm traumatized now, Anybody hear kids say things like that? Well, we're going to get a little bit deeper into kind of what trauma actually does. Trauma can be broken up into 3 different types: acute, chronic, and complex. So acute traumas result from a single event that's perceived as threatening or causing distress. These can be natural disasters, car accidents, rape, or witnessing an act of violence against another person. Chronic trauma results from repeated or long-term exposure to distressing events or conditions. Some of that can include bullying, war, sexual abuse, domestic violence. And then we've got complex trauma, which results from multiple and varied traumatic events or exposure. Typically involves interpersonal relationships, making the individual feel trapped and helpless. Some of the examples of this include neglect, childhood abuse, constant familial contact, and more. I would say the kids and youth that I work with experience chronic and complex trauma most. And that unfortunately will walk through your doors as well at your churches. And so this is mainly for just kind of giving you an overview of how they're oftentimes categorized. one thing I really want you to hear and to know is that trauma changes the brain. It actually changes the structure of the brain. So there's a really great book out there. It's really heady, really intellectual, but it lays this out well. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. And essentially the premise behind it is that traumas kind of get encoded, kind of get remembered in the body. So how many of you have ever walked into a situation and you immediately know, oh, you hear like someone yelling, and immediately you start to tense up, and maybe you're flashing back to another time where you remember something intense happening, and your body starts to already respond to that. Well, Dr. Bezel van der Kolk kind of puts it this way. We now know that trauma comprises the brain area that communicates the physical, embodied feeling of being alive. These changes explain why traumatized individuals become hypervigilant to threat at the expense of spontaneously engaging in their day-to-day lives. They also help us understand why traumatized people so often keep repeating the same problems and have such trouble learning from experience. We now know that their behaviors are not the result of moral failings or signs of lack of willpower or bad character. They are caused by actual changes in the brain. So what does all that mean? I mean, listen, I worked in full-time ministry for years before I pursued a master's in social work, and I'm doing the work that I'm doing now. So I'll be the first to admit that when I'm working with a tough kid, I thought to myself, is this just a bad kid? Or is there something more going on, right? I'm not saying you all have been there. I'm just saying I have been there. So, but knowing this, that trauma is actually, it changes the brain structure, actually helps me to move with more compassion and empathy towards our kids that are displaying those kinds of behaviors. And I think if that can be if you can kind of get that and get that built in, maybe you already do that, and maybe you're already like that. And so I'm just preaching to the choir. But this helped me change, kind of do a shift in my brain as to, okay, there might be more to this story than I can see on the surface. And so it leaves that room for compassion. Their brains have been trained to respond in fear, okay? Which looks a lot like fight, flight, or freeze. Their brains need to create new pathways, ones led by peace, okay? And that takes practice. It takes so much repetition. It takes consistency. It takes unconditional love. It frankly takes the Holy Spirit to really help people moving from a place of fear into a place of faith. And so you are people that are helping to provide that atmosphere, to create that atmosphere where pathways of peace, new pathways of peace can be made in their brains. Okay, I know I'm going by fast. Any questions on the things that I've shared thus far? All right, we'll keep going then. Okay, so some of the behaviors from potential trauma, and I say potential because we can't always draw a straight line from behavior to you're a traumatized kid. Although after 3 years of the pandemic, we're probably all a little traumatized from the whole thing. But here are some examples that you might see. A student in your youth group who always has to be in the front of the line for food, takes more food than everyone else, or always gets seconds. That kid could be struggling from a food insecurity. Maybe he doesn't always have, or she doesn't always have access to food where they grow up, where they live. So there could be a reason for that behavior. Second, student who is clingy and wants to be best friends with every adult and or is indiscriminate about which adults they trust or latch on to. Could be a sign of some early attachment issues or traumas. They may not have been able to or had the opportunity to attach to caregivers at birth or consistently from birth to the time that they walk into your doors. So, could be a sign of that. Student who is fearful of adults or untrusting. I mean, it's a sign of potential physical abuse and trauma in kids. But also, the student may just be sort of introverted by nature. Okay? And then lastly, student who often talks about sex and or more mature subjects with peers and or leaders. And kids it may be a sign that they've experienced some sexual abuse. It may be just that it's kind of the content that they've been consuming for a while. And it may just be like they're just trying to level up with peers for one reason or another, right? These are all behaviors of potential trauma. And I mean, I was going to ask if you've seen any of this in your kids, but I'll keep going. But there are trauma, it can oftentimes mimic other kinds of diagnoses. So I wanted to give you an example of something that you may come across where a kiddo may have ADHD, and some of those behaviors overlap with trauma, but it doesn't mean that they're coming from a trauma background. So this is sort of an example of that. What I'd like to do, rather than reading this whole screen, and I invite you to go ahead and, I see some people already doing it, go ahead and take a picture of it. But I'd like to do sort of a visual kind of exercise right now, where I'm going to just read off the attributes of trauma. And I want you to take a moment to invite the Holy Spirit to talk with you as I'm reading through this. And just let the Spirit guide you and say, hey, is there a kid that that I'm working with, that I know, that I should probably keep in prayer around this? Can we do that? Is that okay? Mm-hmm. All right. So I'll go ahead and start reading them off. And then just let God highlight anyone he wants to highlight. So some trauma attributes. Feelings of fear, helplessness, uncertainty, vulnerability. Increased arousal or edginess in agitation. Avoidance of reminders of trauma. Irritability, quick to anger. Feelings of guilt or shame. Dissociation, feelings of unreality or being outside one's body. Continually feeling on alert for threat or danger. Unusually reckless, aggressive, or self-destructive behavior. So, if we're seeing some of these attributes in our kids, again, they could have another diagnosis, or it could be trauma related. But let's keep going and see what steps we can start taking. So as volunteers that are working with youth, which are a vulnerable population, can be, child abuse and neglect can be a subset of trauma. It is a subset of trauma. And I know we've got some friends here from northern Idaho. I'm not sure how Idaho defines it, but in Washington, they define abuse and neglect as this. It means sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, or injury of a child by any person under circumstances which cause harm to the child's health, welfare, or safety, or the negligent treatment or maltreatment of a child by a person responsible for or providing care to the child. So we all may intuitively be aware of some of this. Physical abuse is the non-accidental infliction of physical injury or mistreatment of a child. I mean, when child welfare professionals are trying to determine whether or not physical abuse is actually physical abuse and not just the kid is clumsy or he tends to fall down or he's a risk taker, and they look at kind of where the physical abuse is. If it's middle of the back, it's really hard to fall in the middle of your back, get a bruise there, and say that it was an accident unless you fell on something that was sticking out. Back of the neck, inner thighs, knees, lower legs, those get scraped up all the time. But they're looking for non-accidental traumas when they're trying to determine physical abuse. Negligence, failure to provide adequate food, shelter, clothing, supervision, or health or dental care. These are actions or failures that create risk to physical, emotional, or cognitive development of a child. So sometimes you can think of physical abuse this way. It's an act of commission against a child or a teen. And neglect could be an act of omission in terms of failing to provide certain needed things for a kid or a student. I just want to say that there are things that the state deals with that do not constitute abuse or neglect. And that includes homelessness, it includes poverty, it includes exposure to domestic violence between other parties. Although that may be an acute trauma that a kid sees, it's not something that the state would hold someone accountable to if it's being witnessed. Okay. So some of the warning signs of physical or emotional abuse or neglect, we'll talk through some physical indicators, some behavioral indicators, direct statements by the student, or statements or indicators from parents or caregivers. Okay. So, physical indicators of abuse or neglect. Would somebody be willing to read these 6 boxes? I don't love hearing myself talk all the time. Would you be willing to kind of read this out for us? Is it okay? Can you see it from there? Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Unexplained burns, bites, bruises, broken bones, or black eyes. Student lacks needed medical or dental care, immunizations, or glasses. Student is consistently dirty and or has severe body odor. Some teenagers just don't jump to conclusions. Student lacks sufficient clothing for the weather. Student reports frequent nightmares or bedwetting. The student has difficulty sitting or walking for non-obvious reasons.
Yes. Okay. So it's important to note that if you're seeing one of these, that it doesn't necessarily indicate abuse. But if you're seeing a pattern of these, you're seeing multiple of these, you're seeing it consistently, it's good to take note. Okay, there should be concern. I should be looking a little bit more closely after this student. Thank you for reading. Some behavioral indicators of abuse or neglect. Anybody willing to read this that can see it, read it? Great, thanks.
Yeah. Student frightened of parents or shrinks at the approach of adults. Student protests or gets upset when it's time to go home. Student habitually begs for or steals food or money. Student abuses alcohol or other drugs. And student's behavior is extreme, overly compliant or demanding, extremely passive or aggressive.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so just kind of in your mind, maybe you've got some students that are displaying these kinds of behavioral indicators. Okay, some direct statements by students which indicate abuse and neglect. Student has conflicting explanation as to how injury occurred. Student reports an injury by a parent or other adult caregiver, and student states that there is no one at home to provide care. Lastly, we've got kind of indicators of abuse from parents or caregivers directly. Parents offering conflicting, unconvincing, or no explanation for a student's injury. Parent describes student in negative terms like evil, rude, or bad. Parent blames, belittles, or berates the student in public. Parent uses harsh physical discipline with the student. Parent seems apathetic or depressed. Parent is abusing alcohol or other drugs, and parent is secretive and or isolated, does not want to be known. So obviously we're all in youth ministry. We're probably good-hearted people too, and we don't like going around being suspicious of other people. I get that. And at the same time, there's a responsibility there as those that are providing safety for students in our events, in our meetings, to at least have in the back of our mind and be willing to ask the question, could there be some abuse happening here? I mean, it's not, as Josh shared when we started, and as the pandemic has proven, families are stressed out. They've been stressed for a while. There's financial obligations, there's health risks, there's other relatives or friends to help take care of, and that sense of community has sometimes been lost among some areas. And so people are a little bit more maybe isolated than they've been before. While under the pandemic, they've maybe a little bit more fearful, and times are tough. Inflation is getting high, you know, in the state of Washington. So sometimes we have to be a little bit more vigilant as we're looking through, and just willing to go there and ask questions. So if we see these kinds of things, if you've kind of got a gut sort of instinct that there might be something concerning happening here, something that needs a closer look, what do you do? What do you want to do? In Washington, they kind of package it this way for mandated reporters: is, hey, we recognize what's going on. You understand some of the signs that we went over, the indicators. Record. I think this is probably what's most helpful, is making sure you have good information, reliable information, that there's accurate details and objective information. Don't rely on your memory. Probably write things down. And then report. Contact proper authority to report suspected abuse or neglect, and follow your church's or program's chain of command for reporting. I can't stress this enough. I was like, if there's anything, especially we've got mostly volunteers in the room, you do not have to make these decisions on your own. Please go to your church leadership or your organization's leadership, share your concerns, and they will help walk through what their procedure would be. But just also know, just understanding this is already putting you ahead of the game. But I encourage you, don't try to deal with it on your own. Sometimes we can build relationships with students, very, very tight relationships with students, and maybe they'll approach you and say, hey, I have something to share with you, but you can't tell anyone. Be careful around those kinds of situations. You don't want to paint yourself into a corner where you are breaking trust, maybe, in order to provide appropriate safety for the kids and the youth. So one of the things that we share with our foster families is say, hey, I love you. I'm committed to your safety and well-being, and I'm more than willing to keep information that's confidential. But I'm also looking out for your safety. And if there's something that you share with me that is either a harm to you or a harm to another person, we need to work through that with the appropriate people. However it is that you want to say it, make sure you say it up front. And while that student may hesitate, maybe fully sharing, at least they know that you're looking out for their well-being. It doesn't do you, the ministry, or Jesus, you know. Actually, let me take that. I don't speak on behalf of Jesus, but it doesn't do you or the ministry any good to keep secrets like that if kids' safety is at stake. Okay. So recognize, record, and report. Now, how many of you in the room have ever had to make a CPS phone call for any reason? Maybe it's not youth group related, maybe it's something else. Okay, we've got a few. So I understand that making a phone call, because of what I do, I've had to do it many times, and I can remember making my first CPS call. It was really nerve-wracking. And if you're close to whoever it is that you're having to call on, there's even more of a hesitation there to take action. So I did want to go over some facts about calling CPS, just to make you aware, build some of that awareness into you. And again, be talking with your leadership, be talking with your church staff to know how to go about doing this. But some of the facts about calling CPS does not mean someone will get in trouble or that a child will be pulled into foster care. Only about 8 to 10% of calls within Washington state result in a child being pulled into foster care. There is a screening process. The majority of calls are screened out, and others are offered services in family intervention. One thing I want to say about this is Washington has really made a shift into doing their best not to have to pull children into care. If at all possible, they would rather provide supports for the family in the home, for the child, and help the family sort of be able to either get connected with supports in their community or build up some of the skill sets that would help them to remain stable and safe for the child. So just putting that out there that CPS tries to not have to pull kids into care if they can avoid it. But child safety is also number one. So the third point, you can't get in trouble for making a report, even if what you reported amounts to nothing. Okay? Some people are concerned about that, and talk a little bit more about that later. Consult with a coworker. Consult with a coworker. Consult with your leadership. Consult with your volunteer coordinator or supervisor, if necessary, before making a report. You do not have to make the decision alone. Okay? Better to err on the side of reporting than to leave a vulnerable child in a situation that they can't get out of or advocate for themselves in. And then there's an intake line for the state of Washington, easy to remember, 1866 end harm. So CPS sort of can sometimes have a bad rap in the community, even though the purpose of it is a healthy thing. It's a good thing. So it can be a little intimidating, but, you know, if you call in, let's say, you can ask to remain anonymous, and they will honor that. Like I said, most calls get screened out, unless there's multiple calls for some of the same people, same individuals in the community. But they'll, like I said, they're trying to not have to bring kids into care as much as possible. There are a number of professionals in our community that are mandated reporters, meaning if they suspect, and it's important to know that you don't have to have evidence that abuse is happening. If you suspect, you can report. It's not your job to play detective in these kinds of scenarios, and I'm sure you don't want to be put in that scenario. There are identified, designated professionals that do that. So, but some of these people, professionals, are mandated reporters. In the state of Washington, clergy are not mandated reporters, but they do elect to report. But if they do elect to report, the report and any testimony that are provided they receive immunity from. And even with that, I would still say err on the side of caution. If you've got a gut feeling, and I believe all of you, have God's Spirit living inside you, He prompts you and highlights things for you as you are going about doing His business. I would encourage you not to ignore that. Consult with the appropriate people, and then don't ignore it. Kind of take the steps that you need to take to ensure that there's safety for your students and kids. Okay, so we talked about what is trauma, what are some of the indicators, what are you responsible for, or should you kind of have in your mind that you have a responsibility around. So we completed, so we're done. So now, And I'd like to open things up for questions before I talk about this last point, if you've got any. Yeah.
So what does the process usually look like when you, like if you were to make a call to CPS, what are kind of some of the basic steps that they take to look into a situation?
Yeah, great question. So for recording purposes' sake, the question was, what is the process on CPS's end once you make a report? Is that
Yes.
more? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an intake caller that will take all the details, and they have a decision tree that they use in order to determine whether or not they will send someone out to do a welfare check, or if they feel like it doesn't meet their certain threshold, then they'll file that away, and in case there are multiple phone calls that happen subsequently,
Okay.
and once that meets a certain threshold, then they'll either do a welfare check of some point, and then at that point, it can go multiple directions depending on how the family responds, how the child responds, and how credible some of the information that has come in is.
Mm. That's super helpful, because I think sometimes it feels like if it's not like a high threshold type situation, you feel hesitant to report it, but
Sure.
it's like it could just be a piece to the puzzle of like other people reporting that. So I think that's good to know that it's like, even if it's not like this is an immediate danger situation, like it's still good to add that piece to the puzzle.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And as people that are maybe in consistent contact with the child, that's a helpful lens to have. Again, their teachers are mandated reporters too, so the teacher could be making calls on her end, and or his end, and you're right. All of that is kind of building an understanding, a profile of the situation. Yeah, a question?
I was just curious, if you were to call and be part of that, or just report something, they wouldn't let us know if something was happening after that, or any follow-up, right?
Right, not necessarily.
So we
Yeah.
need to call with the attitude that we're just a piece, just doing our part and just trusting the Holy Spirit to.
Correct. Yes.
It was so hard for me because I'm always like, well, somebody call me and let me know, that type of thing. So it's kind of hard to just leave it there.
Yes. So the concern that was brought up is whether or not you can expect a follow-up phone call or contact from CPS intake if a report is made. And for confidentiality purposes, you shouldn't expect that. But if you're working with this child consistently, you may hear more around it. And, I do want to put it out there too, is like some people are hesitant because they believe that the family will know who made the call, that they can pinpoint, oh, it's probably this person or probably that person. And there is always that risk when you do report. And at the same time, I've had a couple of different experiences, around, not just a couple, but a couple that I'll highlight is I had one parent that was obviously very upset that they were now kind of having the situation, having CPS involved. But another parent said, you know what, that makes me trust this program even more, that they are looking out, that they're making the appropriate connections where they feel it's necessary, and allowing me to present the facts. So sometimes it turns out that you gain credibility with your community when they know that, okay, we've got people that are trained, that are looking out, and that are still loving on my kid and looking out for their well-being. So thanks for that question. Anything else? Yeah.
With students that have trauma that is not only a danger to themselves, but then other students as well, and then the surrounding family, how would that be handled then, or like reported or dealt with in a safe manner?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is how, for students that are a danger to other students or other just people, either within the family or the community, how would you best go about addressing that need? Well, in your meetings and in your youth group, you set the rules for safety. And so I think maybe revisiting some of how things are done, gaining clarity from church leadership on that is the best way to. I don't want to speak on behalf of your pastor or church leadership, but I would ask, what are our things that we should follow when we have that kind of situation? So within your context, I would go through your church leadership. Beyond that, my recommendation would be to kind of help refer some of that out, okay? And part of the reason that I say that is because in ministry, you get oftentimes invited into very sticky situations with families, with kids in the community, with all kinds of things. And sometimes it's helpful when you can delineate a little bit more your responsibility as a minister who cares, but also who can recognize that this particular situation could probably use the skill set of a different professional to address best. So my encouragement would be that maybe the staff or somebody at the church or somebody who's well versed in the resources in community be able to help kind of provide some recommendations of services to connect with. That kind of leaves you as a support person to the family and the kid, rather than feeling like you have to take on the responsibility of fixing everything, right? Okay. All right, last thing before Josh kind of comes up and closes us out. To make this, I wanted to leave you with something that feels more practical to take back with you to use. And so what's being passed out is a trauma symptoms checklist. And it's written in a way where a child can do a self-assessment, but I don't recommend just handing this out to kids. This is for you to kind of run it through your mind. Okay, what are some of the things that I could be looking out for that are potential signs of trauma? And this is mainly for you to use as a tool to kind of be able to parse out what behaviors could be trauma related and what behaviors maybe this kid just has some quirks. So thank you, and we'll bring Josh back up.
Can we thank Kelly for... Thank you, Kelly. Before we let you go to lunch, I'm sure all of us have been in positions where we've had to deal with trauma in different ways. My first youth pastor job, I was 20, so I knew everything, and just came out of an internship. My first week, my lead pastor pulls me into his office and lets me know that there's an 11-year-old in our youth ministry and a student that just aged out, was 18 at our church, and was asking for sexual favors through text messaging to a point where he'd become a predator, and he wanted me to deal with it. So this potential predator is 2 years younger than I am, and I didn't know what to do. My pastor had a significant background in casework, so he helped me on a lot of the steps. I'll tell you, from what we had to walk through, police had to get involved, had to walk through things. Being able to record throughout the entire process just really helped us on both sides with this girl, but also with this student, to be able to actually get healthy and find the help that he needed. So I'd encourage you to take those. I'd also recommend, you heard the book The Body Keeps a Score. I read this 3 to 4 years ago. It's a good one on Audible too. It is pretty heady, but the whole idea came from some of the doctors that were involved with the terminology PTSD. They're the creators of a lot of this content, so it's actually super helpful. Last thing that I would say too, the mandatory reporting for the youth pastors, youth leaders in this room. This is a hard spot for us to know how to navigate because you hear a lot of stuff. Zach and I no longer work for the network, but during that time, we walked through a lot of moments where litigations were happening in churches and those type of things. I want you to know the network is available, and so if there are times where you're not sure what the next step is, I'd encourage you, bring your lead pastor in, but also call our network office. We have a lot of people in office that want to help you. you are not required to be a mandatory reporter, but if something happens with the child and they come back talking about the church they were engaged with, there's a very good chance that you'll be called in and be questioned, oh, why didn't you report some of this stuff that was happening? So I just encourage you to look at those things in there. The last thing, and I wish I would have brought this with me, email myself or Don Dietrich. I think it's called Church Tax. But there's a class that's $100 that I encourage for all of our kids pastors, for any workers that go in there, that they just go through it on how do we just set up our rooms for safety, and what does sexual abuse look like, and how do we keep ourselves out of realms where those things can happen. Feel free to email Don Dietrich, call our network office, but we can get that to you, or you can give it to your leadership team to walk through. It's about an hour-long video, and it's $100 to have for the remainder of your time. So this is heavy stuff, and I'm glad that you're in the seat that you're in to help with this. So get to help our kids. Kelly, thank you again.
Yeah.
So glad that you were here. I saw Jimmy John's. That should be good.